Hey folks, this is Justin from Books, Bricks, and Boards, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Basic Expert D&D. So while I spent most of my youth playing this version, this is second edition, and I actually have one of my old character sheets from my old second edition games, and I have a lot of good memories from this. But I actually got my start in a version of Basic Expert. Now this is the Moldvay Cook version. I actually played in the Mincer version, but very similar until you add the companion set, almost identical other than layout. So what I'm going to talk about today is why this set still holds so much appeal in 2023 whenever it's been around for over 40 years now. So we're going to talk about why you might consider getting back to BasEx.
Just a thing make you feel better.
When you feel life out of focus, always return to basic of life.
So the first reason that you might want to try Basic Expert or BX Dungeons & Dragons is a nostalgia factor. Now, like I said, I actually didn't use this particular set. I used the Mincer set whenever I played. But even so, just opening these books will immediately transport you back to the early 80s and allow you to feel the weight of the art and the treading of new ground in the words and the rules. It really is a beautiful thing. And other than that too, some of the greatest adventures were built right there in that beginning moments of basic D&D. B2, the Keep on the Borderlands, written by Gary Gygax, probably the most used starter adventure of all time. You got the Isle of Dread, the first big hex crawl adventure, and both of these were available right in the box with the basic and expert sets. So nostalgia is a great reason to try Basic Expert Dungeons & Dragons. You're going to feel the age as soon as you open the page. The ease of the rules. This is a complete game in these two books. Now it is true that in the expert set, Mr. Cook talks about how there's going to be a companion set that expands the rules here. And in that, he talks about the companion set taking the players all the way to 36 levels, which the later companion set for the Mincer set did not actually do. He also talks about some interesting design choices that they were going to try to implement, which they didn't for thief skills in the companion set. But because that companion set for this version of Basic Dungeons & Dragons never materialized, one might think that this was an incomplete game. That is not the case. Most Dungeons & Dragons campaigns are at their best between the levels of 1 and 14. And that's what this is. After you get past 14, really domain play is a great option, and you don't have to worry about the levels as much as the story. But there's a couple of books here. I believe they're each about 64 pages. Right around 64 pages each, yeah. So in 128 pages, you have everything that you need to play the game, including suggestions on how to run a dungeon and a wilderness campaign, with the dungeon being in the basic set and the wilderness being in the expert set. This is your monster manual. This is your combat rules, your exploration rules, your character creation rules, all in these two very thin tomes. So the rules are very light and easy to both teach and learn. Speed of play. Along with the light rules, there is also a very quick play in this game. So, just to give you an example, a couple of weeks ago, I ran a BX dungeon, and my players had never played BX before, and we ran through the dungeon in 4 hours. They completed 8 different combat encounters as well as a number of non-combat encounters in that time. They lost several characters, but the point is that because there are not a ton of rules for every different situation, a lot of these things are just ruled on the fly, and the combat is not bogged down with so many options that it takes forever to get through one. Also, the hit points being lower on the enemies and the players makes that less of a slog as well. So you can play through the same dungeon in BX much faster than you could in a modern system. This next one may be a little bit controversial, but the lack of character choices, because there's only 7 classes in BX D&D. There is Fighter, Mage, Thief, Cleric, Dwarf, Elf, and Halfling. Because there is a relatively small number of character classes, the party role niche protection is much better than in more modern game systems. So in a modern system, there's always the desire to allow the player to creep into other classes' roles, and there is the risk of them taking away the shine from the other classes. I remember as a kid playing the first time, and it was really something spectacular to have the wizard be able to cast that one spell and have a huge impact on the game after he'd been standing in the back and throwing sling stones the rest of the game. Also, in a couple of weeks ago, whenever I ran that dungeon, I was a little bit concerned because it had been many moons since I'd ran a BX game for new players at first level especially, and I was a little concerned. The clerics in BX do not receive a spell at first level, and I thought, I wonder if their character is going to feel effective as a level 1. I know if we were going to play a longer campaign and he was going to grow, that cleric could be quite useful, but I was wondering at level 1 what that was going to feel like. And my concerns were for naught, because the turning ability of the cleric is enough of a niche role that if the DM plans to have a little bit of undead encounters available, that's a very valuable skill, and it probably is one of the factors that made the heroes able to survive the dungeon. So everybody has their role in BX, even the poor thief whose skills are absolutely terrible. But everybody has a role, and everybody gets their moment to shine because their role is not impeded upon by other classes and other characters in the party. Next up, I'm going to talk about character creation and why it is so much faster. You don't have a bunch of feats and skills to choose, at least with the basic version, without any add-ons. You just roll your stats, you roll your hit points, and you write it down on a character sheet, and you're done. I mean, you pick some equipment, but not a whole lot of stuff there. And that's good, because as you notice, a lot of these sheets have cause of death stamps on them. This is from my game a couple weeks ago, and we lost several party members and even more retainers. But that's okay, because I only spent about 5 minutes making each character. If you had this kind of a death toll in a 5e game, players would never come back, because if you spend 2 hours making a character and they die in the first 10 minutes, you're not going to enjoy that game. But that's one of the things that's beautiful about BX is you don't spend a lot of time creating an elaborate backstory for your character. You actually build that backstory through your play, and you really grow attached to the characters because you've lived through so many experiences with them. That's something I feel like is really missing in modern game play, is that you are just kind of telling your own story from your imagination in the modern game, whereas you are kind of reliving your experiences whenever you're creating your story through the game with the old school game. Next up, I have cost. So you can get actual scanned in legit copies of these two books for $5 each from Drive-Thru RPG. You can also pick up the physical copies like these for about $20 to $25 a piece if you find a good deal. At most, around $50 a piece. That being said, if you're okay with doing a retro clone, which some of them are exact copies, just laid out a little bit different and missing some of the IP monsters. If you're okay with that, you could get a Labyrinth Lord. I believe they have maybe a free PDF copy of that. There's a little bit of difference there. I believe clerics do get first level spells at first level whenever you're playing Labyrinth Lord. You can get a variety of different options to play BX at a very reasonable cost. Basic Fantasy, all their stuff is free PDFs. Again, it is a little bit different than this, but if you want to play a true BX game with the rules exactly as written in the 80s, then you could do that for $5 for the basic book and $5 for the expert book. So the cost is extremely reasonable. I'm going to talk a little bit about the availability of material, because if you're playing BX D&D, there is an absolute wealth of options available for adventures and expansions and different rule twists that you can add to your game. So, of course, I mentioned Keep on the Borderland, Isle of Dread. Those are excellent options. You can get very cheap PDFs of those. They're readily available. Old School Essentials has a number of adventures. I have all of them. They're excellent. A lot of them have won awards for the adventure design. I believe they've won some Ennies for that. There's other companies that are doing, like Rackham Vale. This is a very cool new adventure. Not adventure, this is a setting. So this actually has an entire setting that you can do just kind of a hex crawl, and it has all of these different locations laid out with interesting NPCs and monsters. This is all written for the BX rule set. And then there's a number of just OSR in general options. So this is the player's book for the Hot Springs Islands. And there's a number of these that just have some really cool options that you can easily use with BX D&D, because BX is kind of the chassis which all OSR games are built upon. So even if you're going to play something that was designed originally for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you can easily play it on the fly with minimal adjustments in a BX game. So there is just an absolute wealth of options available to play if you play BX D&D. And now I'm going to talk about flavor options. You can play a very bare bones BX game. Old School Essentials has got you covered. It's a perfect match for basic expert D&D. You could add a little weird into your D&D. This is a BX game that adds some interesting takes on demi-human races, and magic works very differently. I will warn you, some of the releases for this are not family friendly, but the game itself is extremely interesting and well written. You could play in a fantastical Asian setting like Scarlet Heroes, written by one of my favorite authors, Kevin Crawford. You can do superheroes, and there's a number of releases by Bloat Games for Vigilante City. Swords and Wizardry is a different take on the BX game. It actually includes a version of the monk that I think is probably my favorite BX take on the monk class. There's Labyrinth Lord, and with Advanced Labyrinth Lord, like the Old School Essentials Advanced set, it adds some of the flavoring from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but with a BX aesthetic. Or you could even play a post-apocalyptic BX game with a game like Mutant Future. And I could go on and on and on. There's Stars Without Numbers, Worlds Without Numbers. There are so many different ways to use that game set to play your version of a role-playing game. Another great BX feature is that anything that was written for TSR D&D, with minimal amount of adjustment, you can easily make useful for your BX game. If you wanted to play Spelljammer, you could easily use that stuff to do a BX game. You could play Dark Sun, you could play Greyhawk, you could play Al-Qadim. If you wanted to steal monsters from the 2nd edition Monster Manual, you could definitely do that quite easily. You might have to make a few little adjustments on the fly, some places a little bit more than others. Dark Sun is one in particular that would take a little bit of thought, but because these are all built upon the same chassis as BX D&D, just with bits and bobs added on, you can easily utilize these to make your own BX game unique and interesting for your players. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is how the lack of rules is actually quite a potent cocktail for creating emergent play options. When I was a kid, when we were playing BX D&D, we didn't know any better, so we just asked the DM what we could do. We'd say, "Hey, can I run up that wall and jump off of it and stab that orc in the head?" "Well, yeah, sure. Give me a dex roll, and then if you succeed, I'll give you a +1 to hit." So we would do stuff like that all the time. And I thought, as the game advanced, that having rules for everything was cleaning that up and making the game more balanced. But in reality, what I've found is that it kind of imprisons the players into thinking there are a limited number of options available to them. Whereas when we were playing, really our imagination was the only limit on what our characters could do. Well, that and how generous our DM was going to be with our crazy thoughts. But that is something that is carried through into all old school Renaissance experiences, but it really was prevalent in the early 80s playing BX D&D, and it still is in any of those different variations of BX that I've talked about with you today. So why should you play Basic Expert Dungeons & Dragons in 2023? Well, at the root of it, it's because this is D&D boiled down to its best and its most essential aspects. You have the pillars of exploration, combat, and roleplay. You have the freedom of imagination of choice. And you have the accessibility of a rules-light system that still covers the necessary bases for it to be a game and not an acting exercise. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you will give BX D&D or one of the retro clones of it a try. I think that for those of you coming from one of the newer games, like the game that will not be mentioned from the Big Fat Wizards of the Coast, I think that you would enjoy the change of pace. And I think if you're a DM, your players would probably grow to appreciate some of the nuances of basic Dungeons and Dragons that have never quite made it to newer editions. So if you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, this has been Justin from Books, Bricks, and Boards. Good gaming, and God bless.